Although I'd like to start with a later one of your problems because it's such an easy one for people to grasp. You call it the day two problem. Explain that.
Right. Well, so suppose we settle on some ideal distribution of resources, so labor resources, natural resources, and other things. And if we adopt either the socialist or a quasi-socialist view where equality, let's say, is an important distribution, whatever that distribution is. Now, and if in addition to settling on that, we then are able somehow to effectuate that distribution in resources today. We get it right. We get all the resources distributed, let's say equally for this, for ease of argument. We distribute them equally. Question then becomes, well, what do we do tomorrow? And on day two, as it were. And the reason that's a problem and a question that has to be addressed is because the minute you allow people, even after you've made your ideal distribution of resources, the minute you stop monitoring and forcing people, they're going to begin to exchange, innovate, associate, trade, gift. They're going to begin doing all the gloriously unpredictable things that free people do, which means that by day two, the distribution of resources is totally different from what it was on day one. And the day two question then is, well, what do we do then? Are we going to have to effectuate yet another mandatory distribution of resources? And that becomes, once you start thinking about what that would entail, you realize that becomes an extremely costly, even putting the moral issue aside, an extremely costly thing to do, because you're going to have monitoring agencies, you're going to have redistributive agencies, you're going to have collection agencies, and all of this is going to have to be going on real time all the time. Because what people do is they find new and unpredictable ways to associate with one another. They look for new and unpredictable ways to innovate. And what will inevitably happen is that their patterns of association, innovation, et cetera, will not match whatever it was you had conceived of in theory in advance. So you're faced with having to make a second distribution on day two, and then this just continues day after day.
What do you mean when you refer to socialism's great mistake in the singular?
Socialism's great mistake. Yeah, and in that part of my book, I'm talking specifically about a moral mistake. And what I mean there is, what socialist inclined policy tends to do is that it views human beings not as fundamentally, anyway, not as individuals, but as members of groups. Members of classes. So it talks about people as being the rich or the poor, or the capitalists, or the bourgeoisie, or the proletariat, rather than seeing them as unique and irreplaceable individuals. And that, I think, is not just a mistake that you might make for economic calculation, but I think it's a moral mistake. One of the great moral achievements, especially of the West, has been exactly the rejection of that view of human beings, that more or less anybody in a particular group or anybody in a particular class, that they're more or less interchangeable. You can take one out without great sacrifice, replace it with somebody else. But I think one of our great moral achievements has been to say, no, that's not true. Each human being is not only unique, but is irreplaceable and precious. And so you cannot take one away without significant and substantial loss. And there is no other human being that could ever replace the position that you or I or any other individual takes. And the great moral mistake I think that socialism makes is to think that we can arrange the classes and the groups in society as if people in them were all more or less the same, when in fact they aren't.